You are calling us to follow. You are calling us to trust. You have seen all our tomorrows. Greater things are yet to come. You will lead us to new horizons.
With today's sermon in our series, Follow Me, the life and teachings of Jesus, here's Senior Pastor Mark Rader.
I don't know about you, but there have been some turning points in my life, fairly significant events and decisions that have been made that have changed the entire rest of my life. Perhaps the most significant of these turning points was when I met and married Nicole. While there's a chance that I may very well have been able to convince someone else to marry me, I would not have been in Australia. I may have had 3 daughters, but the youngest 2 would not have been playing soccer. They would have been playing ice hockey, as they probably should have been if they were in Canada. This decision to marry someone changed the course of my life, and some of you can probably relate to that. Decisions that you made in terms of careers can function in the same sorts of ways. They set your life on a particular trajectory and a particular path. And what we're looking at today is a turning point in the gospel, a place where the entire narrative begins to change in a really quite significant way. And the turning point is Peter's declaration that Jesus is the Messiah. It's found in Matthew chapter 16. Verses 13 and following. And we're told that when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Now, they're not reflecting some sort of belief in reincarnation here. It's not as if they thought that Jesus was John reborn. To some degree, he's asking, who does my ministry remind you of? If you thought about me and you wanted to compare what I do with somebody else, who would you compare me to? And it's a fairly significant list. In John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the other prophets, it's a fairly significant list. And in fact, if I asked you, who does my ministry remind you of? And you said, oh, Martin Luther or John Chrysostom or Charles Spurgeon or Billy Graham, I think I'd be very, very content with any of those comparisons. But for Jesus, none of these comparisons are quite right. And he says, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." This is the first time in the gospel that one of the disciples, or anyone really, has identified Jesus as the Messiah, as the one who will bring in the reign and rule of God, as the anointed one of God. And this is really quite significant. And it's not only a turning point in the sense that the disciples have a new understanding, but it's a turning point because of what Jesus begins to teach. From this time on, we're told in verse 21, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life. Jesus does not begin to teach what it means for him to be the Messiah until his disciples recognize that he is in fact the Messiah. And what he begins to teach as the definitive, essential work of the Messiah is his suffering and death. Now, it was a dangerous time to be a prophet, right? Jesus not only had plots against his life because of the growing antagonism between himself and the religious leaders. Shouldn't surprise us that much. We still hear and read about circumstances in our world where religious differences and sectarianism leads to violence. The same was true in the first century. John the Baptist has lost his life for speaking out about the ethics of the political leadership. But this is more than a premonition. This is not Jesus thinking to himself, given the course of my ministry so far, it's quite likely that I might die. He doesn't begin to teach that it's likely that I might die. He begins to teach that I must die. This is, in fact, the definitive work of the Messiah. Notice that he says that the Messiah must suffer. The Messiah must die. And this is really quite significant. And we need to kind of just pay attention about the ways in which this teaching is reinforced. There's a number of different ways. First of all, there are three mentions of the suffering and death of Jesus. Here in chapter 16, verse 21, again in chapter 17, verses 22 and 23, and again in chapter 20, verses 17 to 19. On three different occasions, Jesus predicts his suffering and death. Even from kind of the overall structure of Matthew's gospel, you would be aware that from chapter 21 to chapter 28, Matthew is concerned to tell us about the events of the last week of Jesus' life. All four gospel accounts slow the narrative down when they come to Jesus' death and resurrection. It takes up an extraordinary amount of the work of each of the evangelists. Interestingly, though, at this point in the story, we're not told why Jesus must die. Don't know if you noticed that. Jesus begins to teach that the Messiah must suffer and the Messiah must die, but does not tell us why. The first example, he just tells us that he's going to die. The same is true in the second. The closest we get to a reason for his death is actually found at the very end of the third prediction in chapter 20, when Jesus goes on to teach and says in verse 28 that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's the first indicator that we're given about why Jesus must die. What we actually find in each of these accounts is that Jesus, once he announces his death, once he begins to explain his death, the implications are not for his death and what it will achieve, but in fact, for his followers. What it means to follow this Messiah who must suffer and die. So in each case, starting in chapter 16, Jesus teaches about his death and then has teaching about the implications for followers. So if you follow on from verse 21 in chapter 16, Peter then takes Jesus aside and says to him, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." And it seems that what Peter is getting at is these expectations about the Messiah, that the Messiah would be victorious, that the Messiah would usher in the kingdom of God, and therefore it was incompatible and inconceivable that the Messiah would suffer and die. Jesus then rebukes him and says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You have in mind the things of men." And then right after that, Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done." Jesus begins to teach about following him and the self-denial that requires. And it's in this self-denial that there is life and reward. Just as Jesus would eventually be raised from the dead, so those who follow after him will receive reward through self-denial. This is the pattern that Jesus provides. Now, lest we think this is an anomaly, or perhaps lest we hope that that's an anomaly, that was just a kind of an unfortunate editing process where Matthew put those two things side by side, the same thing happens in the two other places where Jesus teaches about his death. In chapter 17, after Jesus predicts his death the second time, and there's a little curious tale about the temple tax, chapter 18 opens with, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' And Jesus called the child to him and placed the child among them and said, 'Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me.' Children then, as now, were deeply loved and cared for, but the thing that Jesus draws attention to is that children have, shall we say, no influence. Right? Children, even today, they have no money, they have no experience, they have wide networks, certainly, but they have wide networks of relatively uninfluential people. Right? When my daughters, they come home from school, they know hundreds of people, but none of those people that they know are going to be able to get anything done in this world. None of their friends are people that I want to know to help me get ahead, if that makes some sense. And if you were to help a child, whether it's your own child or a child in the community, they do not have the means to pay you back. For Jesus, who's speaking in a first century honor and shame culture, this was perhaps more pronounced. The idea that children had no real honor, and therefore you didn't have to treat them that well because, well, they were only children. What could they offer you in return? And Jesus says, if you want to become great in the kingdom of heaven, then you must become like this child. You must set aside status and privilege and rights and honor, and you must welcome those who have none. You must welcome those who are, shall we say, in an honor and shame culture, shameful. Welcome them in my name. This is the path of discipleship. And the same thing is true in chapter 20. After Jesus announces his death a third time, immediately following in chapter 20, verse 20, the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons and kneeling down asked a favor. What is it that you want, he asked. She said, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. When the 10 hear about this, because it's James and John that we're talking about, they are indignant, and it gives another opportunity for Jesus to teach. And once again, you hear this same pattern. In verse 25 of chapter 20, Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. I think you see the pattern, don't you? Jesus speaks about his suffering and death and then calls those who follow him to live out that same kind of pattern, self-denial, service of others, setting aside our rights, our privileges, our honor for the good of those around us. And the reason comes back to this simple idea that the definitive, essential, necessary work of the Messiah is to suffer and die. Which does fit with what we've already seen, doesn't it? That Jesus' strategy for bringing in justice to the nations was through not quarreling, not crying out, not breaking bruised reeds or extinguishing smoldering wicks. This falls into that same kind of upside down kind of kingdom. And the implication then for following Jesus, I think, is uncomfortably clear, isn't it? If we are to begin to follow Jesus, then we need to be those who are setting aside our rights and our privileges and our honor and our wealth, seeking to serve those who cannot pay us back, to welcome those who might be considered shameful or less honorable, living out a life of self-denial, taking up, as Jesus said, our own cross and following after him. This is the implication of following Jesus. And ultimately what this comes down to for followers of Jesus is about the act of submission. And submission is a bit of a loaded term in the church. It's often used, I think, in unhelpful ways. But it's inescapable that what we're talking about in relationship to following Jesus is about submission. And if you think about the word submission and the feeling of submission and the act of submission, there are actually two components to it, aren't there? On the one hand, there is the act of acceptance. Right? When we submit ourselves to someone else or to an institution or whatever it might be, we accept their authority, we accept their power, we accept their privileges, we accept whatever it might be that leads us to submit to them. So if you've ever been unfortunate enough to see flashing lights in your rear vision mirror, when we pull to the side of the road, we are accepting the authority of the police officer who is behind us to tell us that our blinker didn't work or that our car is out of rego or to ask us a curious question about our speed, whatever it might be. When we submit to someone else, whoever it might be, whether it's a police officer or our employer or even a friend, we are accepting that they have the authority or the right to ask us to submit to them. And that's the part that we often focus on. And we can see that because acceptance is so important, trust becomes a fairly significant part of submission. It's much easier, isn't it, to accept someone's authority if we also trust them, right? But that's only one half of the act of submission. There's acceptance on the one hand, but true submission also brings with it apprehension. This is where submission differs from surrender, for instance. When we surrender, we are accepting, but only as a last resort, the authority of someone else, right? We have fought it tooth and nail, and now we have come to the point where there is nothing else that we can do but to submit and accept their authority. But when we submit, there is this apprehension that stems from the fact that the individual or the organization to whom we submit may or may not use their authority and power to their advantage and not for us. This is what makes submission difficult. If it were only accepting the authority of another, if it were only acknowledging the power of another, that would be one thing. But there's an apprehension that goes with submission that this might not work out the way I want it to work out. There's an apprehension that they might use their power in a way that hurts me or that diminishes me or makes my life more difficult. But this is submission. If we don't have either of those things together, then it's not quite submission. There's no acceptance, then it becomes an act of surrender, really, where we're apprehensive of what's going to take place, but there's nothing more we can do. And if there's, shall we say, the other side of it, if there's no apprehension, then what we really have is a contract where we're being treated as equals, where I decide what I'm going to do and you decide what you're going to do, and we work out together what we are going to do for one another, and that's a contract with no apprehension. But true submission brings with it both the acceptance and the apprehension, and this is what we find in the act of discipleship. Because discipleship is ultimately an act of submission to the will of God. And so here's the logic of it. Peter has acknowledged that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is indeed God's anointed one, that he represents the plan and purposes of God, and that he is going to usher in the kingdom of God. And then Jesus begins to say, yes, I am the Messiah, but the definitive work of the Messiah, the thing that sets me apart as the Messiah, is that I will suffer and die, and those of you who will follow after me must do the same. If we want life, if we want reward, if we want all the things that Jesus promises to his followers, then we are called ourselves to submit to not just the will of Jesus, but to the will of the Father who sent him. And if you want evidence of this kind of submission, we don't have to look any further, do we, than the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Garden of Gethsemane, we see both the acceptance and the apprehension, don't we? 3 times Jesus prays, Father, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me. There was an apprehension, wasn't there, about what he was about to face, about the suffering and trial that he was about to undergo. If there's any way, can this not happen? But the acceptance, not my will, but yours. Now, Jesus trusted in the Father. He trusted the Father's promises, but that doesn't change for a moment that in that garden experience, there was both apprehension and acceptance. Hearing that we are called to a life of self-denial, hearing that we are called to take up our cross and follow Jesus, hearing that we are called to serve others, to make ourselves last, to not get ahead, to be the ones who are dishonored, to be the ones who are not paid back, that is not easy to hear. That is the sort of stuff that we think about. We go, I don't want to know about that. I want to get ahead. I want my life to be at least a little bit comfortable. I don't want to deny myself. I like me. I want what's best for me. But if we are going to follow Jesus as Jesus followed the Father, then we are called to this same act of submission. And this is not a one-off. This is one of those ongoing decisions that we have to make time and time again. I was recently reminded of this. It was a busy patch. I mean, everyone's busy, and it was no busier than any other time, I suppose. But I found myself getting angry about the reasonable requests that were being made of me. I'd come into work and I look at my inbox and all these emails with stuff to do, and I felt put upon. I felt that this was somehow, asking more of me than they should have. And as it turned out, as I was reading through the Bible this year, through my Bible app, I was reading a similar passage in Mark's account where Jesus makes reference to the fact that he has come not to be served, but to serve. I had one of those moments when God just tapped me on the shoulder and said, you need to read that part again. And I realized that in a very subtle way, and I'm not sure exactly what the process was, but I'd essentially decided that I should be served. And the reason why I was so uptight and why I was so cranky with these reasonable expectations and reasonable requests of my time was because they didn't fit with what I wanted to do. They weren't serving my purposes or my interests. They were just things for me to do that other people demanded of me, and again, quite reasonably. But I felt put upon because I had subtly decided that I no longer wanted to follow Jesus in that way. That I wanted to be served. That I wanted to be the one who was first. And once again, I was brought to the same decision that each of us face, if not every day, then frequently. Will I submit myself to the will of the Father as a follower of Jesus to be the one who serves, to be the one who is last, to be the one who denies myself, the things that I want, the things that will please me, and as a follower of Jesus, set those aside and be last and to serve. This is the crucial and critical crisis of decision that we're called to. And we've been saying, throughout this series that anyone can begin to follow Jesus, that he makes no demands on our faith or on our behavior to begin to follow him, but eventually we will come to the point where we have to make a decision. And this is another of those kinds of decisions when we are called to ask whether or not we will follow Jesus. If you want another example of this same kind of question, you have only to look in Matthew chapter 19, where we're told that a man came up to Jesus and asked, "What good thing must I do to get eternal life?" You might be familiar with the story. Jesus tells him that he should obey the commandments. When the man asks which ones, Jesus responds. And when the man says, "I have kept all of those from my youth, what do I still lack?" Jesus answered, if you want to be perfect, go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. Jesus asks this man at this point in his life to submit his wealth and influence and honor, his status, his comfort, to deny himself and begin to follow Jesus. And while we may not be called to sell all that we own and give it to the poor and follow Jesus, we are called to face this same question of self-denial. The young man, we're told, went away sad because he had great wealth. And so he remained, we believe, with his wealth, but without submitting himself to the will of the Father. And therefore, as Jesus said, he had lost his life, even though he had sought to gain it. Will you submit yourself to the will of the Father? Will you take up not only the apprehension of all that we are called to in self-denial, but accept the authority, accept the character, accept the promises of God, and place our trust in his hands, to submit ourselves, as Jesus himself did, to following in this way, in the way of the Messiah.
We hope you've enjoyed today's New Horizons program. You can download the companion study guides for each program from the Guymer Baptist Church website. Go to guymerbaptist.org.au/New Horizons. These are available for each episode, or you can download the whole series. Guymer Baptist Church in Sydney's southern suburbs is a contemporary evangelical church seeking to serve our local community and help them to know Jesus. At the heart of all we do is the desire to help people love God in all aspects of their lives. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the contact page on our website or visit our Facebook page.
As followers of Jesus, one of the critical decisions that we are called to, one of the crises of faith, is whether or not we will submit ourselves to the will of the Father. And the will of the Father for us is the same as it was for Jesus, that we might set aside our rights, our privileges, our hopes and dreams in order to deny ourselves and serve those around us. Jesus did it and calls his followers to do the same thing. And while this is a tremendous challenge, including both apprehension and acceptance, we can trust ourselves to the hands of our good, gracious Heavenly Father. I trust again that you have been encouraged and challenged this morning. We hope to see you again real soon, and God bless.